This is lecture 9 on Kant's philosophy of the self in the Critique of Pure Reason. And before I start this, I have to make 2 corrections, as I often do. In lecture 8, I said about 20 minutes from the beginning of that lecture. Actually, that was like 18 minutes after the beginning of the lecture. For Hume, spatial contiguity and temporal continuity are 2 sufficient but not necessary conditions of the law of causality. I was wrong. That was totally opposite. I should have said spatial contiguity and temporal continuity are 2 necessary but not sufficient conditions for the law of causation. And at the end of the lecture, like a few minutes before the end of the lecture, I said lecture 5. I should not have said lecture 5. I should have said chapter 5. I said lecture 5. And I should have said chapter 5. So this chapter 5, the necessity of the phenomenal self, this is what I should talk about today. Now, that relation about the phenomenal self and noumenal self, and what you might have said, I say on page 19, the phenomenal self is a necessary result of an activity of the noumenal self. See, the essence of the noumenal self or transcendental ego is the activity. And by acting, it is synthetic activity of the mind which makes the objective construction of nature possible. That's how I that's how I read Kant. Not P.F. Strawson. Strawson says no to that in the bounds of sense. But I really think the very essence of the mind, the essence of the noumenal self or transcendental ego is activity. Now, Descartes said in his Discourse on Method and the 6 Meditations, the mind is a substance. There's 2 substances. There are 2 finite substances. One is body, the other is mind. And the attribute of the body is extension. And the attribute of the mind is thought. And the mind is substance. It is something for Descartes. But for Kant, the mind is not something. The mind is activity. The mind does something. I'll show you. For Descartes, mind, can you see this in this red? Mind is something for Descartes. But for Kant, mind does something. So for Kant, the mind is not something. The mind is not substance. Mind is an activity. for Kant, from the activity of the mind, the nature is produced. So the nature is a product of the mind. It may sound kind of strange, but that's what Kant says. And if the mind acts, if the mind in itself acts, it has to have a, well, the phenomenal self will necessarily appear. I mean, how would I say, the as the result of the acting of the noumenal self, phenomenal self inevitably appears, and I'm one of those phenomenal selves, which is appearing on your computer screen. What's the good example? Okay, this year we'll have presidential elections in the United States. And when a president or any presidential candidate has to pick his or her running mate, any presidential candidate has to have a vice presidential candidate on the ticket. It's pretty much a pair ticket, you know, presidential candidate and vice presidential candidate. Like Kennedy chose Johnson for his running mate, or Humphrey chose Ed Muskie for his running mate. That kind of thing. So phenomenal self and noumenal self have to go together. They cannot be, the noumenal self cannot exist alone. It inevitably has a phenomenal self as its partner. So that but Kant never says anywhere in the Critique of Pure Reason that noumenal self starts acting. And I think that the noumenal self never starts acting or stop acting. It's been acting from all eternity and will continue to act to all eternity. There was no beginning of the acting of the mind. I mean, the mind here, I mean the mind itself, the self in itself, noumenal self or transcendental ego. So the activity of the mind is eternal. It must be. Then the phenomenal self should have appeared from all eternity to all eternity. Phenomenal self, like me or you, must be an eternal appearance. Because the noumenal self has been always acting. Let's put it this way. For Aristotle, there was no beginning in the world. The world has always existed. I mean, you might say Aristotle is outdated, but just listen for a while. I mean, Aristotle is against the Big Bang theory. According to Steve Hawking, there was a Big Bang at the beginning. That's when the universe started. Was that 12 billion years ago? 20 billion years ago? I don't know, but there was the beginning of the universe. There was the beginning of cosmos, according to Steve Hawking. Well, for Kant, I mean, in that kind of question, whether there's a beginning of the universe or there was not beginning of the universe, I mean, those questions fall into the antinomies. Well, antinomies are in the transcendental dialectic. I'm talking about I'm still in the transcendental analytic, and I don't know if when I will go into the antinomies of transcendental dialectic. But apart from the Kant's antinomies, was there a beginning of the world? Was there a beginning of the universe? Maybe there was, maybe there was not. But for Aristotle, the world has always existed. There was no beginning in the universe. I mean, Aristotle talked about unmoved mover, which is like a god. But Aristotle's God is not creator God. It's not like sometime in the past. I don't know, that's 12 billion years ago, 20 billion years ago. It doesn't matter. There was, for Steve Hawking, there was the beginning of the universe. For Aristotle, there was no beginning. The universe has already existed. There was no Big Bang, according to Aristotle. Now, Kant's philosophy is the philosophy of the mind, philosophy of the self. The world as appearance, well, Schopenhauer would say the world as representation. The world as a representation is mind-dependent, and the mind has always acted. There's no beginning of the activity of the action. The mind, noumenal self, transcendental ego, has always acted. Then if the self has always acted, then its partner, the partner of the noumenal self, namely phenomenal self, must have always appeared. See, I talked about Stevenson's book, Treasure Island. Before that, I talked about his book, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. There are two selves. That's strange. I mean, for Kant, there are four selves. Phenomenal self, noumenal self, transcendental ego, and moral self. So, Stevenson saying there are two selves in one man, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are not so strange. One can have two selves. Now, there are two selves. Well, there are four selves, but noumenal self and transcendental ego and moral agent can be the same. But there's a quite distinction between phenomenal self and noumenal self. And it's the noumenal self which acts, which has acted from all eternity. And the noumenal self inevitably has to have the phenomenal self as its partner. As I said, when someone runs for president of the United States, he has his running mate. One cannot just run for president by himself or by herself. He or she has to have the running mate. Likewise, if noumenal self acts, the phenomenal self always has to appear. But the fact is, we appear and disappear. In the Stevenson's book, Treasure Island, in book chapter 2, it says, black dog appears and disappears. Immanuel Kant appeared in 1724 and disappeared in 1804. I appeared, or I started appearing about 60 years ago, and I will disappear about 20 or 25 years ago from now when I die. So people start appearing when they are born, and they stop appearing when they die, or they disappear when they die. But how can it happen? Activity of the mind neither starts nor stops. Then, if the essence of the mind itself is activity, the phenomenal self should appear forever. So I should never die. I want to live forever. Or even if I don't want to live forever, I will have to live forever, because as a phenomenal self, I'm an eternal appearance. That's strange, you might think, but that's the result you get from the critique of pure reason. So maybe, for Kant, the human being must be eternal appearance. Well, maybe Kant's eternal appearance is connected with Nietzsche's eternal recurrence. Because the activity of the mind should never stop. Nowhere in the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant says, well, activity of the mind starts this time and will end. Activity of the mind started 12 billion years ago, the same time as there was a Big Bang. I mean, Kant never said that. So the phenomenal self must appear forever, if Kant's theory is right. So there's no Nietzsche. I don't know how Nietzsche read Kant. He was very, very critical of Kant, but maybe Nietzsche got his idea of eternal recurrence from eternal appearance of Kant. See? Kant, eternal appearance. Nietzsche, eternal recurrence. Because if Kant's theory are right, if the essence of the mind is nothing but activity, see, for Kant, mind does something. And he always does, or the mind always does something. Then the phenomenal self Each human being, so-called human being, must appear to all eternity. Okay, this is page 19. Okay, as I said, this is chapter 5. Chapter 5, the necessity of the phenomenal self. Chapter 5, page 19. If the activity is an essence of the noumenal self and never ends, the phenomenal self should neither start or stop appearing in the phenomenal world. It should have appeared from all eternity and should appear to all eternity. As long as Kant insists that the mind is nothing but an activity, he also has to admit that the phenomenal self is an eternal appearance. The activity always affects inner sense and makes its result, phenomenal self, necessary. Okay, this is page 20. Synthetic activity of my mind is what makes nature the sum of all phenomena possible. And my own body is one of several phenomena synthesized by my mind. The mind cannot synthesize the phenomenal world without synthesizing the phenomenal self. This is like what Descartes says in his Discourse on Method and Meditations, when he talked about the ontological proof of God, ontological proof for the existence of God. He talks about, okay, mountain implies valley. Mountain cannot exist without valley, or valley cannot exist without mountain. Or uphill is downhill. I mean, it depends how you look at it. You see the hill. When you walk up, you say, oh, I'm walking uphill. But when you walk down, the same hill you call, I'm walking downhill. So there's no uphill without downhill. See? I mean, it depends how you look at it. If you when you look at the hill, when you look at the slope, sometimes you call it uphill, sometimes you call it downhill. It depends. Relative. It's like Einstein's theory of relativity. Whether you call that hill uphill or downhill, that's relative. But there can be no uphill without downhill. There can be no downhill without uphill. They're connected. There cannot be no mountain without valley. There can be no valley without mountain. The mountain entails valley, or the valley implies mountain. Likewise, noumenal self implies phenomenal self. The noumenal self cannot exist alone. And also, this is page 20. I say, why then does each man or each human being recover a couple of other phenomenal selves besides his or her own phenomenal and noumenal self to step into the phenomenal world? I mean, life starts when we are born. Well, some people say, well, our life starts when we are conceived in our mothers. Some people say that. But in order for phenomenal self, I'm a phenomenal self, you are too, to be born, to be made, to start appearing, a couple of other phenomenal selves are required. Who are those a couple of phenomenal selves? Our parents, mother and father. In order for a child, a phenomenal self, to be produced, a couple of other phenomenal selves, namely mother and father, are required, or wife and husband are required. They're both phenomenal selves. And this is what I talked about on page 20. So that this and your parents get married, and your mother get pregnant, and you are born. That's when you start appearing. And about 80 years or 85 years after you are born, you die. You stop appearing. What are those things? Well, this is a very complicated matter, and I'd like to, I don't think I can finish chapter 5 today, so I will talk about this problem in my next lecture. This lecture 9 is a bit shorter, or much shorter than lecture 8. I think I talked too much in lecture 8, and some people said, well, lecture 8 was too long, and you talk too slow, so that rather than going on for another 25 minutes slowly, I should end this lecture today, and I talk about the rest of chapter 5 in my next lecture, lecture 10. So read chapter 5. Chapter 5 is, where's that? Where the hell is chapter 5? Chapter 5 starts on page 19, and it goes to page 23. So I'll see you again in a few weeks.